Imagine this. A world so young it has no memory, no soil, no forests, no breath. A world where nothing can die because nothing has yet learned how to live. Picture a planet still cooling from its own creation, its surface a restless skin of molten stone, its sky a dense and shifting haze of steam and volcanic gases. There are no continents in the sense we know them, only fractured plates drifting over an interior still close to the temperature of stars. The oceans are forming as rain that has fallen for millions of uninterrupted years settles into vast basins, turning them dark, acidic, and hot. Nothing moves with purpose, nothing grows, and yet everything is in motion. If you could stand at the edge of this early Earth, perhaps 4,300,000,000 years ago, the silence would feel absolute, but beneath it lies a constant murmur. The hum of reactions happening faster than any biology could keep up with. A world shifting and reshaping itself through cycles so violent they make later catastrophes seem almost gentle. We call this time the Hadean, a name borrowed from old stories of fire beneath the world, but in reality it was more varied than the myth suggests. From what geologists have uncovered in crystals older than any known rock, the surface was not an endless molten ocean, but a volatile mosaic. There were stretches of solid crust that formed, broke, melted, and reformed in steady rhythm. Pools of water collected wherever the ground cooled enough to hold them, but these were not the clear blue oceans that later life would know. They were thick with dissolved minerals, as acidic as some modern mining runoff, and warmed from below by magma chambers that pushed heat upward like a slow and silent tide. Scattered across these plains of rock and turbulent water were mineral chimneys rising from the sea floor, shaped by fluids so alkaline and hot they carried the planet's chemical interior outward. In this world, the line between the inside and the outside of Earth was porous. The planet breathed through cracks and fissures, releasing a constant stream of gases that shaped the atmosphere long before the first organism could influence it. The air itself was not made for lungs. It was a dense mixture of methane, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, steam, and sulfur compounds. Oxygen, the molecule that sustains every complex life form today, was almost entirely absent. We do not know the exact proportions, but the evidence suggests a world where every breath would have been toxic, where each gas interacted with ultraviolet radiation pouring down from the young sun to drive constant photochemical reactions. Lightning storms were frequent, born from the heat rising off volcanic plains and the rapid cooling of steam-filled clouds. At night, if there were nights in any recognizable sense beneath such an atmosphere, the sky would have glowed with auroras triggered by a solar wind far stronger than today's. Even without life, the early Earth possessed a kind of restlessness, a constant exchange of energy between the surface, the atmosphere, and the mantle below. The energy that shaped this world came from every direction. The sun delivered ultraviolet light in intensities that would sterilize modern coastlines in moments. The still-forming moon tugged at the oceans, increasing tidal forces that stirred the planet's chemistry with regular, relentless motion. Beneath the crust, magma rose and fell in great cycles, delivering heat through cracks that reached the sea floor. Electrical storms lashed the young atmosphere and discharged into the oceans, splitting molecules and recombining them in arrangements that had never existed before. Every centimetre of this world was both hostile and rich with possibility, a landscape where molecules were continually broken apart and reassembled into new forms. There was nothing stable about the early Earth, yet stability was not required. What mattered was the repetition of conditions, the constant cycling of energy through matter. This repetition acted almost like a heartbeat. providing the rhythms necessary for complex molecules to arise from simpler ones. Among the most surprising discoveries of the past century is the realization that many of life's essential molecules are not unique to biology. They can form spontaneously under the right conditions, and those conditions were abundant on the early Earth. Sugars, simple nucleobases and amino acids have been detected in meteorites that date back to the time before our planet was fully formed. These same compounds can arise through prebiotic chemistry in star-forming regions, suggesting that the ingredients for life were already drifting through space long before our oceans existed. When comets and asteroids bombarded the young Earth, as they did frequently during the first few 100 million years, they delivered these molecules in quantities large enough to influence the chemistry of entire oceans. At the same time, reactions occurring on Earth's own surface created additional building blocks. The combination of cosmic and terrestrial chemistry produced what some researchers have called an organic haze, a suspension of reactive compounds waiting for the right sequence of events to bind them together in more stable configurations. Within 440 million years of Earth's formation, the evidence suggests that stable liquid oceans were present. This is remarkably early. It means that the window during which life could arise opened not after long geological preparation, but as soon as the planet cooled enough to hold water. The presence of oceans provided both a place where molecules could accumulate and a medium that protected them from the more destructive effects of radiation. At the same time, these oceans were not uniform. Temperature gradients created by underwater volcanism produced regions where chemical reactions happened more quickly. The mineral walls of hydrothermal vents provided catalytic surfaces where ions could gather and react. Even the simple act of waves breaking against mineral-rich shorelines created microenvironments where molecules could concentrate before dispersing again. Each of these settings added variation to the planet's chemistry, increasing the number of pathways through which complex molecules could form. What becomes clear when we piece together these lines of evidence is that the early Earth was not a passive environment waiting for life to emerge. It was active, restless, and saturated with the physical conditions necessary for complexity. We do not know for certain whether life arose in deep-sea vents, shallow pools, volcanic lakes, or some combination of environments, but the evidence suggests that multiple pathways could have supported prebiotic chemistry. What matters most is that the planet supplied gradients, boundaries, and cycles. These are the conditions under which simple molecules can persist long enough to interact, forming larger structures that can in turn influence their surroundings. The early Earth was not simply a setting. It was a participant in the process that would eventually give rise to LUCA. It shaped the boundaries within which molecular cooperation could begin, and provided the energy flows that allowed certain reactions to dominate over others. Life did not appear on a barren stage. The stage was already in motion, its surface shifting beneath storms that never ceased, its oceans stirred by heat from below and radiation from above. In such an environment, the emergence of biology becomes less a miracle and more an outcome of persistent conditions. When matter is exposed to continuous energy gradients, it explores every possible configuration. And over geological time, certain configurations outlast others. They remain, they accumulate, and they begin to interact in ways that hint at a future beyond chemistry. The Earth of the Hadean was already prepared for life in this quiet, relentless way. Its landscapes, temperatures, minerals, and atmospheres combined to create a world where complexity could take root, because simplicity was never allowed to rest. To understand LUCA, we must first understand the world it inherited. All right, hello fellow sapiens, sit back, relax, and prepare to drift into the deepest beginning we know, the first ancestor, LUCA. how did matter become life? Tonight we're stepping into a world older than fossils, older than sunlight, older than anything that ever breathed. A slow walk back to the moment chemistry first leaned toward biology. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science, quiet clarity, and slow storytelling for tired minds who still wonder about deep time. I'm not here as an authority, just another curious primate awake beside you, trying to understand how life began on a world that should have stayed silent. Picture a moment when the world held no ancestors, no lineage, no footsteps behind us. A moment so early that even the idea of a beginning had not yet begun. If you were to look at Earth then, you would not find creatures waiting to evolve, or cells hesitating at the brink of living. You would find only reactions, unfolding because the laws of physics allowed them to unfold, happening in patterns that did not yet mean anything, but would one day become the quiet scaffolding of all meaning. To study this time is to stand before a door that has not been invented, trying to understand what it means to enter a room when neither the room nor the idea of entering exists. We are looking at a world where nothing is alive, but nothing is entirely dead either. Everything is suspended in an early confusion, a chemistry restless enough to be mistaken for intention. Before life, the world held only cycles and improbable arrangements of matter. There were no organisms, no reproduction, no heredity, no failure, no survival. There was only the slow accumulation of reactions that repeated not because they were favoured by biology, but because they were permitted by physics. When we trace the story of life backward, we eventually reach a point where the language we rely on as biologists stops functioning. Words like growth, competition, or adaptation fall away. We enter a terrain defined not by ancestors, but by possibilities. And this is where the search for life's true beginning becomes most difficult. We know that at some point, Earth transitioned from a domain of pure chemistry into one where molecules could preserve the patterns that allowed them to persist. But the region between those two states is neither chemical nor biological. It is something in between, a coastline where every tide reshapes the boundary. One of the earliest challenges in studying this time is the paradox that life is usually defined using life as the reference. Researchers describe living systems by their ability to metabolize energy, maintain internal order, grow, and reproduce. Yet crystals can grow, storms can organize, and some computer algorithms can evolve complexity without being alive. If we use tools meant for biology to study what came before biology, we find ourselves describing shadows with the vocabulary of daylight. So scientists turn instead to the smallest components that living systems share. Molecules that carry information, molecules that perform work, and boundaries that separate one system from another. These become the clues, the archaeological fragments of a time that left no fossils. Among these fragments are organic molecules that the early Earth formed without help from organisms. Sugars, amino acids, and nucleobases emerged through prebiotic processes, not because they were useful for life, but because they were natural outcomes of the planet's chemistry. Experiments beginning in the 20th century demonstrated that simple gases subjected to electrical discharges can produce amino acids. Meteorites that formed before Earth existed preserve sugars and nucleobases created in interstellar environments. Even on modern planets without life, ultraviolet radiation striking carbon-rich ices can create compounds that resemble the ingredients of early biochemistry. These findings show that the building blocks of life were not rare or miraculous. They appeared wherever energy flowed through carbon-bearing material. The question was not whether such molecules existed, but how they could persist long enough to matter. Once a world contains millions of copies of simple molecules, something subtle begins to happen. Reactions compete. Molecules that break apart easily disappear. Molecules that remain intact for longer periods accumulate. Chains of reactions that reinforce themselves appear more often than those that terminate quickly. This is chemical selection, a precursor to biological selection. It does not rely on heredity or reproduction. It simply follows the rule that stable arrangements endure. When researchers investigate these pathways today, they find that certain reaction networks naturally generate their own catalysts. These catalysts increase the speed and efficiency of the pathways that created them, drawing more raw material into their orbit. Over time, such cycles become more prominent in the chemical environment. They are not alive, but they behave in ways that make life possible. To understand why complexity can arise in open systems like the early Earth, we turn to the role of entropy. At first glance, the spontaneous emergence of order seems to contradict the second law of thermodynamics, which states that disorder increases over time. But when energy enters a system continuously, it can create local pockets of structure even as the total entropy of the environment rises. This is the same principle that shapes storms, ocean currents, and crystal formations. Energy flows make patterns possible. In the early 21st century, physicist Jeremy England proposed a thermodynamic lens for viewing the origin of life. He argued that under the right conditions, matter exposed to consistent energy sources will naturally explore states that dissipate energy more effectively. Some of these states resemble the organisation seen in living systems. Whether England's interpretation captures the full story remains debated, but it provides a useful way to understand why reactions may have become more complex without the guidance of genetic inheritance. As complexity rose, certain reaction networks became more persistent. Chains of molecules began amplifying their own creation, creating feedback loops that drew in energy and raw materials. These autocatalytic sets did not need enzymes, membranes, or genomes to function. They required only the right molecules and the right environment. Over long spans of time, some networks may have begun to influence the conditions around them, altering local chemistry and favouring their own continuation. This shift did not create life, but it nudged Earth toward a state where molecules could interact with consequences. It allowed the environment to begin shaping which reactions thrived and which faded. The border between chemistry and biology is not a line but a long, wandering coastline. It meanders through regions where molecules form patterns that persist, break apart, and reassemble, guided not by purpose but by probability. Somewhere along that coastline, the first molecules learn to preserve themselves. Yet even with these early networks forming, the world was still in a state that defies our categories. The reactions unfolding were not guided by genes, because no genes yet existed. They were not catalyzed by proteins, because proteins had not yet evolved. Every reaction was a response to local conditions, a burst of heat from a shifting fracture beneath the sea floor, a momentary shift in pH as minerals dissolved into water, a change in concentration as tides drew pools together and then apart. If molecules formed patterns that persisted, it was because those patterns happened to withstand the turbulence of their surroundings. And if those patterns faded, the world simply tried again. There was no failure in the biological sense, only the endless experimentation of a planet that had more patience than any organism that would one day inhabit it. Researchers studying these early processes often turn to laboratory models to understand how simple molecules behave under repeating cycles. When solutions of organic compounds are dried and rehydrated over and over, they sometimes form longer chains that would not appear in a static environment. Heating and cooling can change the shape and reactivity of molecules in ways that favour the emergence of new properties. These cycles mimic the natural rhythms of the early Earth, where day and night, tides, volcanic pulses, and shifting mineral surfaces offered constant variation. We do not know for certain which of these cycles were most important, but the evidence suggests that early chemistry was shaped not by steady conditions but by fluctuating ones. It was within these fluctuations that new combinations could arise, persist briefly, and influence whatever formed next. Another clue comes from the study of mineral surfaces. Many minerals bind organic molecules in specific orientations, holding them in place long enough for reactions to occur that would be unlikely in free solution. Clays, iron-sulfur compounds, and certain volcanic minerals can align molecules in repeating patterns, creating templates for greater complexity. These minerals acted almost like silent participants in the prebiotic world, shaping the geometry of early chemistry without consciousness or intention. Some experiments show that when simple molecules interact with these surfaces, they can form structures that resemble primitive scaffolds for later biological pathways. The minerals themselves do not store information, but they can create environments where information-bearing molecules become more likely to form. What lends these details such weight is the slow realization that none of this required foresight. The reactions that shaped the prebiotic world did not anticipate LUCA or anything like it. They simply followed physical rules. When we look at modern cells, it is tempting to imagine that each component was designed to fit neatly into a larger system. But the earliest chemical environments were far messier, filled with pathways that began and ended without leading anywhere. Many of the molecules produced in these environments never contributed to life in any form. They were byproducts of the planet's early chemistry, present for a geological instant and then lost. The few that persisted long enough to influence subsequent reactions did so because they were compatible with their surroundings. They offered stability or reactivity at the right moment. They endured not because they were useful in the future, but because they made sense in the present. This is the world from which the first molecules capable of preservation emerged. Before the first cell, before the first genome, before the first ancestor, Earth was already shaping the conditions that would make heredity possible. The confusion of this early chemistry was not a barrier to life, but a prerequisite. From the perspective of billions of years later, it resembles a long preparation, a slow gathering of tendencies that would eventually produce structures capable of remembering themselves. It is this gradual assembly of conditions, patterns, and constraints that narrows the vast chemical landscape into something that points toward biology. Somewhere along that coastline, the first molecules learned to preserve themselves. If you enjoy these calm journeys through ancient history and early science, feel free to like or subscribe gently, not for numbers, but because it helps other sleepless thinkers find a little clarity in the dark. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Are you falling asleep, working late, driving through the night, or hearing this on headphones in a quiet room? And remember, if you drift off, there are timestamps waiting for you when you return. Alright, let's continue, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Picture a moment when the world was still young enough that almost every molecule on its surface was meeting the others for the first time. Imagine those early oceans not as symbolic primordial soup, but as a restless landscape where heat, minerals and dissolved gases drifted through each other in patterns that changed hour by hour. In that world, with no cells to organize chemistry and no enzymes to accelerate reactions, every molecular encounter was governed by chance. And yet, some of those encounters produced combinations that seemed strangely suited to one another, arrangements that endured just long enough to influence whatever happened around them next. Why did certain molecules, out of billions, begin cooperating? The question seems almost philosophical, but its answer lies in the details of chemistry, and in how the physical structure of matter quietly sets the stage for biological possibility long before biology exists. In this early world, nothing resembled the organised complexity of living systems. There were no blueprints, no selective pressures in the Darwinian sense, no replication of patterns over generations. What existed instead was a planet filled with energy and elemental abundance. Every atom carried with it possibilities determined by the number and configuration of its electrons. Among these atoms, carbon held a unique position. The evidence suggests that carbon's ability to form 4 stable bonds and create long chains, rings, and branching structures allowed it to participate in a dramatic variety of reactions. This versatility is not a biological invention. It arises from the quantum behavior of carbon's electrons, a property that predates life by almost 10 billion years. When carbon encountered hydrogen, oxygen, or nitrogen in the early oceans, it could bind with them in countless ways. Many of those bindings were fragile, easily broken by heat or radiation, but a few formed stable intermediate compounds that contributed to more intricate chemistry. Without carbon's structural flexibility, the early Earth might have remained a world where molecules only combined briefly before dissolving into simpler forms again. As the planet continued to cool, conditions changed in ways that altered the reactions possible in its oceans. Experiments performed in the last century demonstrated that simple organic compounds can arise under conditions that mimic aspects of early Earth. Certain mixtures of gases, when exposed to electrical discharges or ultraviolet radiation, produce amino acids, the small molecules that later become the building blocks of proteins. Other reactions involving hydrogen cyanide and formaldehyde can generate sugars, some of which play roles in modern genetic material. In separate processes, nucleobases can form through the rearrangement of nitrogen-rich compounds. We do not know which precise sequence of events occurred on Earth, but the evidence suggests that a variety of simple lipids, amino acids, and nucleotides arose through natural chemical evolution. These molecules were not alive. They did not replicate, carry information, or influence the world around them. Yet their presence created a chemical environment very different from what existed before, one rich in components that would eventually participate in the reactions we now call metabolism. Another source of organic molecules came from beyond Earth. Meteorites that formed during the earlier stages of the solar system preserve amino acids in concentrations and varieties similar to those produced in laboratory simulations. Some of these amino acids show isotopic patterns that indicate an extraterrestrial origin, formed in cold interstellar environments where cosmic radiation interacts with simple ices. When such meteorites fell to Earth, especially during the heavy bombardment period that ended around 4 billion years ago, they delivered these compounds to a planet already rich with its own prebiotic chemistry. This blending of terrestrial and extraterrestrial molecules increased the diversity of the early oceans and introduced combinations unlikely to form through a single set of Earth-based reactions. The result was an environment where chemical pathways that might otherwise be rare became more probable simply because the necessary ingredients were present in abundance. As the number of organic compounds increased, their interactions became more complex. At first, these interactions were entirely governed by random motion. Molecules drifted through water, bounced off mineral surfaces, and collided with one another at rates determined by temperature and concentration. Most collisions led to nothing lasting, but occasionally a particular arrangement persisted long enough to undergo further reactions. Some of these reactions produced compounds with properties that made them less likely to break apart. Others created molecules that bonded more readily to certain minerals. In this way, pockets of chemical stability emerged within the larger turbulent environment. These pockets were not alive, but they represented early steps toward cooperation, where certain molecules helped create the conditions that allowed other molecules to persist. Mineral surfaces played an important role in shaping these interactions. Many minerals found in volcanic and oceanic environments have active surfaces that can hold organic molecules in place. When molecules adhere to these surfaces, they are oriented in ways that can promote reactions impossible in free solution. It is on such surfaces that some scientists believe the first nucleotides may have formed. Certain clays can bind simple molecules and align them in repeating patterns, effectively serving as scaffolds for the assembly of more complex structures. Other minerals, such as iron-sulfur compounds, can participate directly in reactions that resemble early metabolic pathways. These mineral-assisted processes did not require biological catalysts. They depended only on the physical properties of the minerals themselves, properties that existed long before any organism evolved to take advantage of them. Beyond the influence of minerals, the early Earth also contained chemical pathways that favoured accumulation over random dispersal. Some reactions produce byproducts that help stabilise intermediates, creating feedback loops that draw additional molecules toward the same pathway. These loops are not autocatalytic in the biological sense, but they exhibit a similar tendency. Certain reactions become more likely as their products increase in concentration. Over long periods of time, this can lead to localized environments where specific molecules are present at higher levels than elsewhere. These environments, in turn, provide a foundation for more complex interactions. One might imagine them as chemical neighborhoods, regions where chance combinations become more probable, simply because the necessary components are already nearby. What becomes apparent from this growing complexity is that life may be improbable when viewed from the scale of human experience, but chemistry is persistent when given geological time. Reactions that occur rarely on human timescales can occur countless times over millions of years. Even rare combinations repeat if a planet continually stirs its oceans, fractures its crust, and drives energy through its atmosphere. The early Earth provided these conditions not for a moment, but for spans of time so long that improbable events became inevitable. In this sense, the cooperation of molecules was not an accident, but a consequence of a world where chemistry had the time and energy to explore every possible pathway. The story told by geology, chemistry, and experimental evidence suggests that the molecules that formed the foundation of a life did not arise through a single miracle. They appeared through countless small steps distributed across many environments. Each step depended on local conditions, whether the presence of a particular mineral surface, the concentration of a specific compound, or the influx of organic molecules from space. Together, these steps created a chemical landscape where some molecules began to persist longer than others, where cooperation emerged not from design but from compatibility. As these molecules interacted, some combinations proved resilient, enduring just long enough to influence future reactions. This resilience is what matters most when thinking about the origin of life. Cooperation among molecules did not emerge because life needed it. It emerged because certain combinations survived the turbulence of their surroundings. When these combinations repeated often enough, they shaped the chemical environment in ways that allowed new interactions to occur. Over time, this created networks of reactions that hinted at the possibility of information storage, inheritance, and metabolism. These networks were still far from life, but they marked a shift toward patterns that could endure not just for moments, but for cycles. They were the first signs that chemistry was beginning to step toward biology. But building blocks alone are not life. Something had to store the first instructions. As these pockets of resilience grew more common, the oceans began to host regions where interaction shifted from isolated events to sequences. What had once been a scattering of molecules drifting through water became, in certain places, a loose choreography. Some compounds tended to accumulate near warm mineral surfaces, while others gathered in cooler shaded pools. The geography of early Earth created gradients in temperature, salinity, and pH, each gradient subtly influencing which molecules lingered and which drifted away. These gradients did not create order in the biological sense, but they created patterns, and patterns are the first hints of direction in any system. One of the most striking clues about these early interactions comes from how certain organic molecules behave when exposed to cycles of concentration and dilution. When water evaporates, compounds that were once dispersed become crowded together, forced into close proximity in ways that increase the odds of new reactions. When water returns through rain or tides, the newly formed molecules dissolve again, free to drift into other environments. Repeated over countless cycles, this simple alternation of pressure and release allows a chemical mixture to explore a vast range of possibilities. It is not intentional exploration, but statistical inevitability. The planet's rhythms acted as a slow and steady experimenter, trying every path available without preference. Other environments added their own subtleties. In volcanic regions, gases bubbling through shallow pools carried dissolved elements to the surface, creating microenvironments distinct from the surrounding water. Some of these gases interacted with organic molecules to create chemically reactive intermediates that would not have formed otherwise. In other places, cold seeps on the ocean floor introduced compounds into waters that otherwise changed very little. These contrasts meant that Earth was not a single chemical environment, but a sprawling mosaic of conditions. Every environment offered a different set of possibilities, and somewhere within this mosaic, the combinations that would eventually matter became slightly more likely than the ones that led nowhere. What makes these processes so revealing is the way they stretch our understanding of cooperation. In modern biology, cooperation is tied to inheritance and selection, but long before life existed, molecules cooperated simply because their structures allowed them to fit together in ways that endured. Sometimes the cooperation lasted only moments. Sometimes it lasted long enough to be altered by subsequent reactions. In rare cases, it lasted long enough to influence the broader environment around it. These were not partnerships in any purposeful sense, but arrangements stabilized by the rules of chemistry. And so the early Earth became a place where certain bonds formed, not because they were destined for biology, but because they survived the forces that acted upon them. The world's chemistry did not move toward life with intention. It moved toward life because certain pathways remained open while others collapsed. Over millions of years, this quiet persistence created a narrow corridor through which complexity could grow. And at the end of that corridor, the groundwork had been laid for something new to appear, a way for matter to hold onto its own pattern. Imagine the moment when the world first created something capable of remembering itself. Not an organism, not a cell, not anything we would recognize as alive, but a pattern written in matter, able to preserve its own arrangement long enough to influence what came next. Before ancestors, before evolution in the biological sense, before inheritance or memory or lineage, there was a single kind of molecule that could do something the rest of Earth's chemistry could not. It could copy itself. And in a world governed only by reactions, collisions, and chance, the ability to remember one's own shape was the first spark of continuity in an otherwise forgetful planet. What emerged from this quiet shift was not life, but the possibility of life. The evidence suggests that this first molecular memory belonged not to DNA, which today carries the instructions for nearly every organism, but to a simpler and more primitive molecule, RNA. Unlike DNA, which has a tightly constrained structure and serves almost exclusively as a storehouse of information, RNA has a dual nature. It can hold patterns, sequences of chemical letters arranged in a meaningful order, but it can also fold into intricate shapes that perform tasks. In modern cells, these tasks range from assisting protein synthesis to regulating gene expression. But long before any cell existed, the earliest RNAs likely acted as both blueprint and tool, storing sequences while also helping reactions along. This versatility made RNA uniquely suited to bridge the gap between a world of chemistry and a world of biology. We do not know for certain whether RNA appeared first or whether simpler ancestors preceded it, but the evidence suggests that RNA possessed properties that no other known molecule could combine. In the prebiotic environments of early Earth, the formation of RNA was not a single step, but a sequence of small cumulative events. Sugars, phosphates, and nitrogen-rich bases existed in various combinations across oceans, volcanic pools, and mineral surfaces. Under the right conditions, these components linked into short chains. Most of these chains were unstable and broke apart quickly, washed apart by tides or disrupted by heat. Yet the constant cycling of environments allowed these strands to form again and again. Random polymerization produced a diversity of sequences, each with its own potential to fold or interact with other molecules. Some strands curled back on themselves, forming loops and stems that made them more resistant to breakdown. Others twisted into shapes that altered the environment immediately around them, influencing how nearby molecules reacted. None of this was intentional, but it marked the beginning of a new behavior in matter: self-assisted persistence. Among these primitive strands, a few developed the ability to act as catalysts. These catalytic RNAs, called ribozymes, could accelerate specific chemical reactions by stabilizing transition states or bringing reactants into favorable positions. Modern ribozymes provide a glimpse of what these ancient versions may have done. They can splice other RNA molecules, form bonds between nucleotides, and even assist in copying segments of RNA. Laboratory experiments have shown that some ribozymes can extend short strands or help align molecules to continue a chain. On early Earth, such ribozymes would have been exceedingly rare, but when they did arise, their presence likely influenced the chemistry around them in profound ways. A ribozyme capable of helping a strand grow could ensure that its own structure, or structures similar to it, became more common. This was not inheritance in the biological sense, but it introduced a powerful bias into the chemical environment, patterns that help themselves persist. Despite these promising features, RNA was not a stable resident of the open ocean. It was fragile, prone to breaking under ultraviolet radiation, heat, or fluctuating pH levels. The earliest oceans were vast and turbulent, offering little protection for delicate strands. Many researchers believe that the first significant RNA chemistry did not occur in open water, but in confined cyclic environments where molecules could be concentrated and shielded. These environments might have included mineral pockets, porous rocks near volcanic regions, or small pools subject to drying and rehydrating cycles. In such settings, RNA strands could form, fold, and interact repeatedly with a limited set of molecules, increasing the likelihood that useful patterns emerge more than once. The instability of RNA became less of a barrier when the environment itself acted as a protective framework. Within these sheltered settings, a remarkable shift took place. Some RNA strands began to act as templates for their own replication. In templated replication, a strand sequence guides the formation of a complementary strand, which can then serve as a template to recreate the original. This process transforms a mere chemical structure into a carrier of information. Although the replication was likely error-prone, these errors introduced diversity, allowing environments to explore multiple possibilities at once. Occasionally, a variant might fold into a more stable shape or catalyze a reaction more effectively. Over time, the interplay between sequence, structure, and function created a primitive form of selection among molecules. Patterns that survived long enough to replicate had a greater influence on subsequent chemistry. Patterns that could not withstand their surroundings faded quickly, their instructions lost to dissolution. This early form of memory was astonishingly modest. RNA could not encode complex systems or control elaborate reactions. It could not sustain itself without continual input from the surrounding environment. Yet even the simplest templated replication introduced a new concept to the planet: continuity. Before replication, every chemical pattern ended when its physical structure broke apart. After replication, patterns could survive the destruction of their individual molecules. In essence, information became independent of matter. It could persist as long as the environment allowed the copying process to continue. This independence marks the first hint of heredity on Earth, the earliest instance in which the world began to preserve patterns longer than molecules. Such a system did not yet qualify as life. It lacked the boundaries, the metabolic machinery, and the capacity for sustained evolution that define living organisms. But it established the foundational requirement for all future biology: the ability to store instructions and reproduce them. Once RNA could copy itself, however imperfectly, the doorway to inheritance had opened. In the long span of geological time, even small improvements in replication or stability could have significant consequences. A strand that folded into a more protective shape might endure longer. One that catalyzed a helpful reaction might generate a local environment more hospitable to strands like itself. Gradually, these tendencies accumulated, guiding chemistry toward greater order without requiring any foresight. The existence of this primitive memory transforms our view of early Earth. Instead of a world where molecules collided without consequence, we begin to see a world where certain patterns began to persist, guiding the formation of future patterns. The earliest instructions were not written in words or symbols, but in the arrangement of atoms. They carried no meaning in the human sense, yet they shaped what followed. And as these instructions repeated, altered, and occasionally improved, they created a foundation upon which more complex systems could eventually assemble. The molecules themselves were fleeting, but the sequences they carried endured. In these sequences, the first whisper of continuity emerged from a world otherwise ruled by impermanence. Yet even memory requires a body. Molecules needed shelter to persist. Imagine a moment when the world was nothing but reactions drifting through open water, a place where every molecule was exposed to the full force of heat, radiation, and dilution. Now picture something quietly astonishing. The first time matter enclosed itself. No hands, no intention, no design. Just a small group of molecules responding to the rules of their surroundings, curling into spheres because water pushed them into that shape. Boundaries appeared long before bodies did. And once the first boundary formed, even by accident, it created a place where reactions could gather, concentrate, and persist. It is easy to assume that early cells required craft, assembly, or some rare creative event, but the evidence suggests something humbler and far more elegant. The earliest walls did not arise despite water. They arose because of the way water behaves. This revelation rests on a simple fact of chemistry. Some molecules carry two personalities at once, a dual nature that becomes important whenever they meet water. One end of these molecules is attracted to water, while the other recoils from it. Chemists call them amphiphilic, but long before that word existed, these molecules drifted through Earth's early environments with this tension built into their structure. Fatty acids are one of the most ancient examples. They consist of a long tail that wants to avoid water, and a small head that wants to embrace it. When placed in water, they cannot stretch themselves in a way that satisfies both impulses. Instead, they join with others like them, clustering until the water-facing ends point outward and the water-fearing ends hide safely inside. Under the right conditions, these clusters curve in on themselves, forming spheres. Each sphere becomes a hollow chamber, a tiny interior protected from the world outside. We do not know for certain whether these were the first boundaries ever formed, but experiments under plausible early Earth conditions show that such structures arise spontaneously, without direction or control. The structure of these spheres is called a bilayer, a double sheet of amphiphilic molecules arranged so the water-loving heads touch water on each side, while the tails remain sandwiched between. When many of these molecules gather together in early Earth mixtures, they form hollow vesicles known as liposomes. Modern biochemistry uses them to study drug delivery and membrane function, but their deeper significance lies in how easily they form. When fatty acids are shaken in warm water, spheres appear. When heated and cooled, they divide. When new fatty acids are added, they grow. None of these behaviours require enzymes or specialised pathways. They are built into the physical properties of the molecules, properties that existed billions of years before life. In experiments designed to mimic primordial conditions, liposomes form near hydrothermal systems, in evaporating pools, and even in solutions containing minerals that could plausibly have existed in the earliest oceans. Their formation is not a rare event. It is a natural consequence of amphiphilic chemistry. What these early membranes enabled was not protection in the way we think of it today, but concentration. In the open ocean, molecules disperse quickly. Any reaction that begins in one place is diluted almost immediately as water carries its reactants away. But inside a small enclosed volume, reactions can proceed with far greater consistency. Even a primitive membrane creates a space where molecules are trapped long enough to influence one another. In this sense, compartmentalization was not a luxury, but a requirement for the next steps in chemical evolution. When RNA strands or other catalytic molecules became trapped inside these vesicles, their interactions intensified simply because they could not drift apart. We do not know for certain how often these molecular traps formed or how long they lasted, but the evidence suggests that early Earth environments provided countless cycles of concentration and dispersal. Each cycle created new combinations. Each combination allowed new reactions, and each reaction increased the odds that the next one would matter. The stability of these early membranes depended on a delicate balance of environmental factors. Heat could make fatty acid chains move more freely, increasing fluidity but also risking collapse. Salt concentrations changed how easily molecules joined the bilayer. Too much could disrupt the structure, too little could prevent it from forming. Variability itself, however, seems to have been crucial. In environments where conditions changed slowly, membranes could assemble, grow, and divide without disintegrating entirely. In other settings, hot springs undergoing rapid evaporation, coastal pools subject to tides, or porous rocks exposed to fluctuating temperatures, membranes could repeatedly break and reform. This repetition was not destructive. It created opportunities for content exchange, allowing vesicles to pick up new molecules or shed old ones. A protocell that reformed around a new mixture of internal molecules might behave differently from its predecessor. In the long stretches of geological time, such differences mattered. One of the most intriguing consequences of these early boundaries is what they allowed inside. Reactions occurring within a membrane-bound compartment became partially insulated from the outside environment. This does not mean they were fully protected. These early membranes were porous, leaky, and vulnerable to distortion. but even porous boundaries created gradients. Solutes inside and outside existed at different concentrations. Some molecules crossed easily, others lingered. These differences made certain reactions more favourable inside than outside. A strand of RNA enclosed within a liposome might persist longer, or encounter compatible molecules more often simply because it had less space to disperse into. If any molecule inside the vesicle helped stabilise its walls, or influence the rate at which molecules crossed the membrane, that vesicle might grow more robust over subsequent cycles. Again, this is not selection in the biological sense, but selection in a purely chemical sense. Structures that endured had a greater presence in the world. The first microscopic rooms on Earth therefore emerged not because life needed them, but because water demanded them. The amphiphilic nature of early lipids made enclosure the most energetically favourable arrangement, and once enclosure existed, it changed the possibilities available to chemistry. Inside these fragile spheres, reactions took on new rhythms. Concentration altered their speed. Boundaries altered their outcomes. Molecules that might never have met in the open ocean became neighbours. Catalysts that might have diffused to nothing instead created small local environments of greater activity. In a world still dominated by randomness, these compartments introduced a subtle form of order, an order grounded in geometry, not in tension. When we imagine protocells, it is tempting to picture miniature versions of modern cells, complete with complex machinery and tightly regulated membranes. But the earliest compartments were nothing like that. They were unstable, prone to rupture and reformation. They lacked the ability to control what entered or exited. They did not repair themselves or regulate their composition. Yet their simplicity was their strength. A membrane formed because its molecules preferred that arrangement. It grew when additional fatty acids drifted into place. It divided when physical forces pulled it apart. Each of these processes occurred naturally. No sophisticated biochemical system was required. Life's earliest boundary was not built. It assembled itself. This reveals a deeper truth about early evolution. Before inheritance, before metabolism, before the elaborate interactions that define biology, Earth created the first spaces where reactions could become more than transient events. Boundaries turned chemistry into experience, because once molecules shared the same interior, their reactions could persist long enough to leave echoes. And once echoes accumulated, they shaped what happened next. A protocell did not need intention to influence the world. It needed only the ability to hold things together for a while. The rest followed slowly, step by step, as reactions repeated, variations emerged, and stability became a rare but meaningful advantage. Inside these fragile bubbles, something remarkable began to happen. Imagine a moment when the world's chemistry behaved as it always had, following the rules of physics, responding to heat and pressure, dissolving and recombining without purpose. And then imagine a moment just slightly different, when a reaction completed itself and by doing so, made that same reaction more likely to happen again. Picture a molecule that did not simply exist but contributed to the conditions that would produce more of itself. In this small shift, the universe moved closer to something we would one day call choice. Not conscious choice, not anything like what living organisms perform, but a faint chemical preference, a tilt in probability, a reaction favouring its own persistence. How did chemistry, with no plan and no intention, first learn to choose? The revelation lies in a phenomenon known as autocatalysis. An autocatalytic reaction is one in which the product assists in creating more of itself. In modern biology, enzymes perform this role, accelerating reactions central to metabolism. But long before enzymes existed, The evidence suggests that Earth hosted simple chemical loops that encouraged their own continuation. These loops did not require complex structures. They emerged from particular combinations of molecules that, when present together, accelerated the same series of reactions that produced them. In this way, a reaction pathway could generate more of the molecules that sustained it. The world was still prebiotic, but certain reactions began to recur more often than others, not because they were predetermined, but because their outcomes created conditions that favoured their own repetition. To understand why autocatalysis matters for prebiotic evolution, it helps to picture early Earth as a landscape of competing chemical cycles. Every environment, whether a volcanic pool, a hydrothermal vent, or a drying shoreline, supported different sets of reactions. Some cycles consumed available resources quickly and collapsed. Others proceeded slowly, vulnerable to disruption. Only a few cycles produced intermediates that made the entire sequence run more efficiently. These efficient cycles drew in more reactants, diverted resources away from rival pathways, and established themselves as persistent features of their environment. Experiments with simple organic compounds reveal how easily such cycles can emerge under the right conditions. Even without biological catalysts, certain combinations of molecules create mutual reinforcement, allowing a chemical network to grow at the expense of others. As these networks expanded, they began to exhibit behaviours that resemble very early shadows of metabolism. In modern cells, metabolism is a coordinated web of reactions that harvest energy, build structures, and maintain order. But the first hints of metabolism were much simpler. They were loops in which a product increased the likelihood of producing additional products, forming open, repeating chains. Some of these chains generated compounds that made the local environment more favourable to the reaction sustaining them. Others created small gradients, attracting molecules into a confined space where the reactions could continue. These were not yet systems capable of adaptation in the biological sense, but they exhibited a form of persistence rooted in physical laws. A cycle that sustained itself had an advantage over one that did not. This simple advantage created the earliest competing pressures on Earth's chemistry. When two cycles required the same reactant, the cycle that regenerated itself more efficiently consumed the resource first. The other cycle weakened, slowed, or ceased altogether. In this way, selection existed even before life. It had nothing to do with survival or reproduction. It had no lineage or inheritance. Yet in these prebiotic environments, reaction networks that created more of themselves displaced those that did not. The world did not require organisms to begin sorting through possibilities. The molecules themselves, through their interactions, created conditions in which certain patterns endured while others faded. Over geological time, such persistence made a difference. Reactions that continued long enough had downstream effects, influencing which molecules were available for later steps in the journey toward life. One striking feature of autocatalytic networks is their sensitivity to concentration. In dilute environments, they struggle to maintain momentum, as reactants drift too far apart to interact reliably. But in enclosed or cyclic environments, areas where water evaporates and returns, where minerals channel reactants into small volumes, or where primitive membranes trap molecules, the efficiency of autocatalytic processes increases dramatically. This sensitivity created another form of selection. Networks that could operate within fluctuating environments, tolerating shifts in temperature or salinity, were more likely to persist. Those that required narrow conditions failed when the environment changed. Early Earth's variability therefore acted as a filter, eliminating cycles that depended on fragile circumstances and preserving those that functioned across a range of conditions. Another key insight emerges from studying modern chemical systems designed to mimic early Earth's conditions. When mixtures of organic molecules are left to interact, multiple loops often form simultaneously. These loops compete for shared resources, much like organisms will do billions of years later. Some loops grow rapidly and collapse, others grow slowly but stabilize. In some experiments, a loop that is initially weak can become dominant when environmental conditions shift, illustrating how external pressures influence the earliest chemical selection. These dynamics reveal a world in which molecules did not simply drift and react, but participated in networks that responded to their surroundings. The prebiotic Earth, far from being chemically static, was a place where reactions shaped their environment and were shaped by it in return. If we step back and observe these processes, the picture that emerges is neither mechanical nor mystical. It is patient. The earliest autocatalytic networks were fragile. They failed often. They depended on opportunities that appeared and disappeared on geological timescales. Yet each time a cycle repeated, it created the possibility of further refinement. In a world with billions of reaction cycles occurring across millions of environments, even rare improvements mattered. A slight increase in efficiency could allow a network to persist through a period of drought or warming. A minor structural change in a molecule could alter the speed of a reaction, just enough to give it a competitive edge. Chemical evolution, driven by persistence rather than purpose, began to leave subtle traces in the world. These chemical traces laid the groundwork for what came next. Once persistence became possible, complexity could follow. A network that favoured its own continuation created a platform upon which other reactions could build. New molecules passing through such a network might be incorporated into its cycle. Others might strengthen it by stabilizing intermediate steps. The network might, over time, become more robust or more efficient, not because it pursued these qualities, but because the world rewarded sequences that could withstand disruption. Long before Darwin, Earth was already selecting. It selected reactions that endured, pathways that forged their own persistence, and structures that improved their odds of survival. Chemistry, given enough time, became something that preferred its own continuation. But to become life, these reactions needed a stable source of energy. Imagine sinking beneath an ocean so old it had never seen a fish, an ocean dim and heavy, where sunlight could not reach even if it tried. Picture that descending silence, the pressure thickening around you, the world becoming darker until sight gives way entirely to the feeling of movement. Now imagine that in this total darkness, long before the first ancestors of cells learned to drift or swim, there were places on the ocean floor that glowed without light. Not from fire, but from chemistry. Not from heat alone, but from the planet itself exhaling energy through the crust. These places did not resemble anything alive, yet everything about them behaved as if life had already been rehearsing. And it is here, in these silent black plains, that we find the first answer to a simple but haunting question. Where did early chemistry find the power to begin choosing? We do not know for certain, but the evidence suggests that deep underwater, along the edges of spreading seafloor ridges, towers of porous minerals rose from cracks in the earth like ancient jagged chimneys. These structures were built not by hands but by geology, as water seeped into warm crust, reacted with the mantle's minerals, and surged back upward as hot alkaline fluid rich in hydrogen. When this fluid met the colder, more acidic primordial ocean, it precipitated iron sulfide minerals into towering labyrinths filled with microscopic channels. These channels, narrow as hair and often only a few micrometers across, created protected pockets unlike anything else on Earth at the time. and within them flowed gradients of energy so stable and so persistent that, for hundreds of millions of years, they worked like natural laboratories continuously running experiments. To understand why these places matter, we must return to the chemistry unfolding inside them. The walls of these vent structures, composed of minerals like greigite and mackinaw-white, behaved as natural conductors. They allowed electrons to move in controlled ways from one side of a boundary to the other. The fluid rising from the interior was alkaline and saturated with hydrogen, a molecule eager to donate electrons. The ocean outside was acidic and carried dissolved carbon dioxide, a molecule eager to accept electrons. Where these two fluids met inside the rock's porous structure, a remarkable thing happened. A natural gradient formed, not unlike the proton gradients used by every living cell today to create energy. This gradient allowed protons to move in a single direction across mineral membranes, and wherever controlled movement occurs, so does potential work. What modern cells do with complex proteins, these rocks did with physics alone. Inside these mineral pores, the boundaries were not fragile like lipid membranes, but sturdy and conductive, allowing reactions to repeat without being washed away. The mineral surfaces acted as scaffolds, bringing hydrogen and carbon dioxide into contact and encouraging reactions that reduce carbon into forms more useful for building larger molecules. We do not know the full sequence, but research in geochemistry suggests that simple organic molecules could form in these confined spaces through reactions that required no enzymes, no RNA, and no deliberate guidance. Instead, they relied on the natural alignment of gradients, temperature differences, and catalytic mineral surfaces. Over time, some cycles of reaction would have repeated more efficiently than others, producing steady flows of molecules that could build upon themselves. These vent structures also provided something that early protocells formed from lipids could not yet offer: stability. In the open oceans, heat, salt, ultraviolet radiation, and turbulence broke down fragile organic molecules before they had any chance to accumulate. But inside the mineral chambers of these vents, the environment was insulated from ultraviolet radiation and buffered from extreme temperature shifts. It created a consistent thermal and chemical environment that persisted for vast spans of geological time. Every pore, nook, and grain of mineral became a potential stage for chemical cycles to intensify. One detail that researchers find striking is how closely these vents resemble the internal architecture of living cells. The gradients across their mineral membranes mimic the proton gradients across modern mitochondrial membranes. The iron-sulfur minerals that coat their internal walls resemble the active clusters inside many of today's most ancient enzymes. The chemical reaction of hydrogen with carbon dioxide is still used by some of the oldest microbial lineages known. None of this proves that life began in these structures, but it does show that early metabolisms were not created out of nothing. They emerged from geological systems that already mirrored their logic. As we look deeper into these environments, we see that mineral pores offered not just protection but compartmentalization. Each pore isolated a tiny volume of fluid from the world outside, creating microenvironments where reactions could intensify. Different pores had different temperatures, different catalytic properties, and different ratios of hydrogen to carbon dioxide. This diversity produced a vast range of chemical conditions running in parallel, like an immense natural laboratory with billions of tiny test chambers. Over time, cycles that harnessed the existing energy gradients more efficiently would have dominated these microenvironments, driving weaker cycles to extinction, not by violence, but by diminished flow. Even before biology existed, competition was already a part of the world. We do not know how long these cycles endured, but geological records suggest that such vents were active for hundreds of millions of years during the planet's earliest history. That is enough time for even slow, inefficient chemical pathways to iterate countless times. It is enough time for chance encounters to repeat often enough to become reliable. It's enough time for cycles that produced more concentrated carbon molecules to stabilize, and for reactions that linked carbon chains together to gain footing. In such a stable environment, selection could operate without the need for genes. Stability itself became the pressure that determined which cycles persisted and which dissolved back into the surrounding waters. One of the most revealing aspects of these vents is the way they combine confinement with flow. A cell confines its chemistry within a membrane, but it also needs a constant flow of matter and energy to stay alive. These mineral structures provided both long before biological membranes existed. Water flowed through the pores in a predictable manner, bringing fresh reactants and removing waste products. The mineral surfaces acted as catalysts, increasing the likelihood of useful reactions. The electron gradients acted as a persistent source of energy. In effect, these chambers behaved as proto-metabolic environments, systems that ran on energy gradients and generated organic molecules far from equilibrium. As we follow this picture, we see that early Earth was not a static world, but a restless interface of heat and chemistry. The vent fields were not mere geological oddities, but places where controlled energy flow was possible for the first time. Hydrogen gas rising from the mantle carried with it an enormous store of potential energy. Carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean represented an enormous pool of carbon waiting to be reduced. When these two met across catalytic mineral surfaces, they began reactions that today form the backbone of ancient microbial metabolisms. It is not difficult to imagine how, over time, these reactions could become more elaborate, gradually forming loops that regenerated their starting materials. The geological structures themselves also changed. As fluids continued to rise and cool, the mineral walls thickened, altering the geometry of the pores. Some chambers closed off, others widened. These changes created new opportunities for chemical cycles that could adapt to altered conditions. Over long spans of time, stable cycles might have been displaced by more efficient versions of themselves, much as later biological evolution would replace less effective traits. The minerals did not evolve, but the chemistry inside them did. What is most remarkable is that these rocks provided something that later cellular life would spend immense energy recreating. Modern cells use membrane proteins to pump protons across boundaries, establishing gradients that power metabolic reactions. In these vents, the gradient was already present, ready to be harnessed. Modern cells use iron-sulfur clusters inside proteins to transfer electrons in controlled ways. In these vents, the walls themselves contained iron-sulfur minerals capable of facilitating electron flow. It is as if the earlier cells inherited the principles of metabolism from geological ancestors, refining them into biological machinery. By imagining this environment, we can begin to understand why so many origin of life researchers consider these vents plausible birthplaces for life's earliest metabolisms. They offered long-term stability, continuous energy, catalytic surfaces, compartmentalization, and natural gradients. They were not gentle places by human standards, but they were predictable, and predictability is the foundation on which any form of sustained complexity must stand. Without such stability, chemistry would remain dispersed and disorganized. But within the walls of these vents, reactions could build, repeat, and gradually take on characteristics that resemble metabolism. We must be cautious not to overstate our certainty. We do not have fossils of chemical reactions, nor do we have a direct record of the first metabolic pathways. but we do have physical principles, geological evidence, and the remarkable similarity between vent chemistry and modern cellular processes. These clues, taken together, suggest that life's earlier steps were not leaps, but gradual refinements of processes already happening in the deep ocean. As we leave this part of the story, we should hold one quiet realization. These vents were not habitats in the way we understand the word. They were laboratories that ran without interruption for longer than the human mind can easily grasp. Their floors were covered not with organisms, but with possibility, and across countless cycles of flow and reaction, something within these chambers began to resemble ancestry. Within these environments, a distinct ancestral lineage began to emerge. Imagine for a moment arriving at a time when the word ancestor still had no meaning. Picture a world where nothing yet had parents, where nothing had offspring in any sense familiar to us, and where heredity existed only as a drifting tendency, not a lineage. It is difficult to place ourselves inside that kind of world because it is older than every branch on the tree of life, older than the roots themselves. It is a time when chemistry was almost biology, when the first shapes that would one day lead to genomes and species had begun to thicken out of the noise, but had not yet settled into stable forms. This borderland is where the earlier shadows of ancestry appear. Not ancestors yet, not organisms in any way that life would later define, but something like precursors, blurred forms with no fixed identity. If LUCA is the first creature that qualifies as a biological someone, then what existed just before it were communities where someone did not yet exist. We know this era largely because of the work of the microbiologist Carl Woese, who spent much of the 20th century studying the deep structure of genetic evolution. Woese noticed something strange. When he tried to reconstruct the earliest branches of life's genealogical tree, the data refused to behave. Genes that should have told the same story did not. Lineages that ought to have been distinct were blurred. The very concept of a branching evolutionary tree seemed to break down when you stared too closely at the foundations. And so Woese proposed a striking idea. Before true cells emerged, before LUCA arrived with a more stable genome, the world was home to entities he called progenotes. These progenotes were not individuals. They were not species. They were not organisms with clean boundaries. They were more like shifting collectives, loose and permeable, exchanging genetic fragments as readily as water exchanges temperature with air. The reason, we believe, lies in the nature of pre-DNA heredity. In this early stage of evolution, the molecules responsible for replication were still primarily RNA-based. RNA can copy itself, but it does so poorly. It can fold into catalytic forms, but it does so inconsistently. It can store information, but it does so in a fragile, unstable way. A progenote's attempt to replicate itself was more like a suggestion than a command. When one of these early entities divided or grew or merged, what passed into the next generation was less a fixed sequence of nucleotides and more a collection of tendencies, reaction networks that worked well enough to be repeated, not precise instructions preserved with fidelity. These progenotes lived inside membranes because compartmentalization was already crucial, but the membranes themselves were loose and leaky, prone to bending, rupturing, fusing. Their boundaries were more like wet soap films on a windy day than the strictly regulated cellular walls we know now. Under conditions like these, heredity does not operate the way it does in modern biology. Instead of vertical inheritance, where parent gives rise to child, early evolution appears to have operated horizontally. Genes did not descend, they spread. Information wandered. Useful molecular innovations did not remain inside the progenote that produced them. They drifted into neighbouring progenotes, into membranes that happened to be nearby when a fragment escaped or was absorbed. The absence of genetic fidelity meant that no progenote could lay claim to its own identity. Each one was a mixture of what it inherited and what it borrowed. Species did not yet exist because the idea of a species requires a stable, collective lineage. Here, everything was temporary. Every boundary was soft. The entire community behaved like a single, vast, distributed experiment. What the evidence suggests is that evolution at this stage happened not through competition between individuals, but through collaboration between networks. The unit of selection was not an organism, but a reaction system. If a new catalytic pathway emerged inside one progenote, it could spread throughout the network simply by leaking, merging, and exchanging molecules. What improved the survival of one tended to improve the survival of all. Life's earliest evolutionary steps therefore resembled something communal, not because these entities were cooperating in any conscious sense, but because their chemical architecture made individuality impossible. You could not keep your discoveries. You could only share them because sharing was built into the physics of your membrane and the looseness of your replication. This is a world we struggle to imagine because modern life is built so deeply on the idea of individuality. Even bacteria today fiercely maintain their genomes, passing them with intimidating precision across generations. But before LUCA, precision did not exist. Fidelity was a luxury life had not yet invented. The progenote era worked on different rules: low accuracy, high exchange, and rapid turnover. The result was a wild, communal churning of genetic fragments, like a vast ocean where currents constantly redistribute patterns of information. Instead of species emerging from ancestors, ancestors emerge from the blending of communities. To understand this, we have to imagine heredity as a fluid. In our world, heredity is a chain. In theirs, it was a tide. One progenote might contain part of a metabolic cycle, another might hold a slightly more efficient variant, a third might harbour an early ribozyme. But none of these innovations remained local. They diffused the moment membranes touched. They drifted when protocells ruptured or fused. Over time, the network as a whole accumulated more stable patterns. Not perfect sequences, not genomes in any modern sense, but modular chemical solutions that kept resurfacing because they worked. This is perhaps the most striking thing about the progenote world. It was not built on survival of the fittest, but on survival of the most shareable. No fossil or direct trace remains of these early communities. They existed hundreds of millions of years before the oldest microfossils. We infer them indirectly, through patterns in modern biology that cannot be explained by a simple vertical ancestral tree. The fact that core cellular processes are universal, things like the genetic code, ribosomal structure, ATP metabolism, suggests that these systems emerged in a world where information spread horizontally and universally. LUCA, when it finally crystallized out of the progenote network, inherited these universally shared processes not as innovations from a single lineage, but as stable solutions that the entire community had converged upon. This means that LUCA was not a sudden invention. It was the stabilization of a pattern that had been drifting for a very long time. LUCA was the moment heredity stopped behaving like a tide and started behaving like a chain. It was the moment genetic information became enclosed, regulated, preserved. And that shift required more than new molecules. It required the emergence of identity, the first boundary that truly held. Before LUCA, identity was fluid. After LUCA, it hardened into lineages. We tend to imagine life's origin as a moment of creation, but what the evidence points to is more like a long evening, during which a diffuse communal chemistry slowly condensed into a handful of stable, inheritable structures. LUCA is the first point at which we can look backward and say, Here is where the story of ancestry finally becomes legible. And yet the most humbling thing about this chapter is that life began in community, not in isolation, not in competition, but in a world where information was shared because the boundaries were too soft to hold it. That early communal phase does not resemble modern ecosystems, nor does it resemble anything in human experience, but it reminds us that individuality was not always the rule. It emerged later as an evolutionary convenience. Life's earliest chapter was a shared effort written across membranes so thin they could not keep their discoveries to themselves. Softly, all of this leads us toward LUCA, not the first life, but the first entity sturdy enough to persist as a lineage, the first creature with a genome coherent enough to pass down without dissolving into its neighbours, the first thread in a tapestry that has now grown to cover an entire planet. Transition. Out of this churning genetic sea, LUCA began to differentiate. Imagine standing beside a world that has no ancestors yet, only chemical attempts at endurance. Picture a moment when nothing on Earth could truly be called alive, and yet the ocean floor was crowded with reactions that behaved as though they were preparing for something. Here, in the warm fractures of the early sea, a lineage began to sharpen. It was not the first flicker of life, nor the first membrane, nor the first strand of replicating molecules. It was instead the first combination of all these things in a form that would never be lost again. When we speak of LUCA, the Last Universal Common Ancestor, we're not speaking of the origin of life, but the first organism that was unmistakably alive in the way we mean it today, capable of preserving its identity, copying its instructions, and generating the patterns from which every creature on the planet now descends. We do not know when LUCA lived with absolute precision, but evidence suggests a time more than 4 billion years ago, when the world was still young and profoundly unstable. The revelation that LUCA was not the first creature, but the first fully coherent one, comes from a simple truth in genetics. Across all life, from bacteria to archaea to the complex cells that eventually produced animals and plants, there exists a shared molecular toolkit. Ribosomes that translate genetic code, transfer RNAs that ferry amino acids, enzymes that maintain the structure of genetic strands. These features do not appear randomly across the tree of life. They cluster at its roots. When researchers compare the genomes of thousands of modern organisms, they find a set of ancient genes present in every lineage. If they survived 4 billion years of mutation, drift, and natural selection, then they likely belong to the organism that sat at the trunk before life's 3 great branches diverged. LUCA, as reconstructed through these universal genes, begins to take shape not as a mystery, but as a faint silhouette made visible by what all living things still carry. Researchers have identified hundreds of genes shared across bacteria and archaea, the 2 deepest and most divergent domains of life. Some govern core metabolic functions, such as enzymes that process hydrogen, carbon dioxide, or iron. Others preserve DNA, fold proteins, and regulate the earliest ribosomes. Tellingly, many genes that appear universal today are not modern luxuries but molecular necessities for survival in an environment rich in hydrogen and poor in oxygen. These clues point back to deep-sea alkaline vents, where hydrogen-rich fluids rose from the mantle and met an ocean still acidic and chemically restless. In this world, LUCA likely lived not freely swimming in open water, but anchored within the labyrinth of mineral pores that lined these vents. These chambers provided stable gradients of temperature, acidity, and chemical potential, conditions that primitive cells could not create for themselves. At the heart of LUCA's reconstructed metabolism lies a simple strategy: combining hydrogen with carbon dioxide to form methane, or related compounds in reactions driven not by oxygen, but by natural proton gradients across mineral walls. This kind of chemistry persists today among some of the most ancient archaea, organisms that live in environments strikingly similar to the conditions thought to dominate early Earth. It is not that LUCA breathed or ate in any modern sense. It is that it used the environment's electrical and chemical differences to push matter through pathways that preserved its structure from one moment to the next. This is the defining point at which chemistry begins to resemble life. When matter moves not randomly but consistently, reinforcing the form that performs the reaction. LUCA carried ribosomes, suggesting that it could translate genetic instructions into proteins. The ribosome is often described as a molecular fossil, a machine so ancient that its core structure has barely changed in billions of years. To find ribosomal components shared by bacteria and archaea means that LUCA already had a functioning system for converting information into action. Alongside the ribosome were tRNAs, small molecules that pair with specific amino acids. Their conserved shapes and sequences suggest that LUCA inherited not just genes, but a genetic language with rules that survive to this day. The presence of such machinery means LUCA was far beyond the fragile world of RNA-only progenotes. It had crossed into a realm where patterns were stable enough to be inherited accurately, yet simple enough to remain close to their chemical origins. One question remains unresolved. Did LUCA use DNA or RNA as its primary genetic storehouse? Evidence suggests it used both, but in a transitional form. Many universal genes encode proteins responsible for DNA repair, replication, and maintenance. Yet the machinery associated with modern DNA replication appears to differ between archaea and bacteria. This implies that LUCA may have relied on a simpler, more ancient system, perhaps one that used DNA for stability, but had not yet standardized the sophisticated enzymes seen in later lineages. The sequence of events remains debated, but the consensus is that LUCA possessed a hybrid system anchored firmly in ribosomal translation, with DNA serving as a more durable foundation than RNA alone could offer. The reconstruction of LUCA also reveals what it lacked. LUCA had no complex cell walls as seen in bacteria today. It had no ability to metabolize oxygen, because oxygen did not yet exist in the atmosphere in meaningful quantities. It had no cytoskeleton of the kind that allows modern cells to maintain shape or movement. It may not have duplicated by dividing in the manner of modern cells. Instead, it might have relied on the natural splitting of mineral compartments or simple membrane budding. LUCA was both more primitive and yet more complete than we might imagine. It did not resemble a microbe from a textbook, but neither was it an unstructured chemical film. It held a suite of functions that have never been lost, not even as a life exploded into countless forms. To imagine LUCA is to imagine an organism that emerges not suddenly, but as the endpoint of a long, blurry transition. It sits at the crossroads between communal gene trading and inherited lineage. It bridges the time when identity was fluid and the time when children resembled their parents. It represents the moment when life began to carry a past, when instructions no longer arose from random collisions, but from the continuity of generations. LUCA was unmistakably alive, not because it was complex, but because it could maintain its form in defiance of constant disruption. Its membranes may have been thin, its genetics imperfect, its environment unforgiving, but its core machinery worked well enough to persist and give rise to all that followed. The realization that the molecules inside our cells echo LUCA's architecture suggests that our biochemistry is a 4 billion year inheritance. When a ribosome assembles a protein in your body, it uses a mechanism that predates continents. When your cells convert energy through proton gradients across membranes, they follow a pattern older than the oceans. Inside us lives the memory of an ancestor that emerged not from chance alone, but from the planet's own chemistry, sculpted by time, stability, and survival. To understand LUCA fully, we must explore what it could do and what it could not. Imagine lifting the earliest ancestor of all life out of its world and placing it gently onto the surface of ours. Picture a tiny cell, built to endure an atmosphere without oxygen, a sea without light, and a crust that breathed hydrogen through mineral veins. In your hands it would seem fragile, quiet, almost simple. Yet within its delicate boundaries lies the inheritance of every creature alive today. And still, if exposed to modern Earth, it would perish in an instant. The paradox is unsettling. The organism that gave us everything was perfectly suited only for a world that no longer exists. We do not know for certain exactly how LUCA would react to conditions on our planet today, but every piece of evidence suggests its biochemistry was crafted for a time before oxygen, before continents, before the sky turned blue. Scientists reconstruct LUCA not by imagining a creature, but by identifying what every lineage has preserved. These universal genes trace back to a metabolism that used hydrogen and carbon dioxide in an environment where oxygen would have been lethal. Oxygen, which now fills our atmosphere and powers complex life, was once a toxic intruder. For LUCA, which relied on ancient pathways incompatible with oxidative stress, even a whisper of this gas would have dismantled its core chemistry. Modern organisms protect themselves from oxygen with antioxidant enzymes, membrane adaptations, and elaborate molecular pathways. LUCA had none of these. It lived in a world where reactive oxygen species were almost absent, where cells never needed to defend themselves against such attacks. Its metabolism was likely based on iron-sulfur clusters and hydrogenase enzymes that break down when exposed to oxygen. In today's conditions, these structures would fail rapidly, unravelling the energetic foundations of LUCA's survival. Just as threatening would be the sunlight itself. In LUCA's time, Earth lacked a protective ozone layer. The sky was not the safe filter we know today, but a source of intense ultraviolet radiation that scoured the surface. Life therefore remained deep, protected beneath water or crust. LUCA likely inhabited the porous structures of alkaline hydrothermal vents, shielded from radiation by stone and depth. If placed on Earth's surface now, its membranes and genetic material would be torn apart by ultraviolet light within moments, because it lacked the sophisticated repair systems that modern cells evolved over billions of years. The enzymes that heal DNA, the proteins that recognize and correct damage, the pigments that absorb harmful wavelengths. None of these were part of LUCA's world. Even the simplicity of its membranes reveals this vulnerability. LUCA's boundary was probably thin, flexible, and dependent on its surrounding environment for stability. Modern bacteria and archaea possess complex lipid structures, tailored to withstand heat, salt, acidity, and mechanical pressure. LUCA's membranes were closer to early protocells, functional but easily disrupted outside narrow chemical conditions. Exposed to modern salinity levels, temperature fluctuations, or oxygen concentrations, they would collapse. LUCA did not live freely in the water column. It occupied the protected microcavities of mineral chimneys, where physical conditions changed only gradually. Remove LUCA from these gradients, and its chemistry loses direction. It cannot generate energy on its own. It relies on natural proton flux across mineral walls. It cannot regulate its internal environment. It depends on the stable architecture of vent structures. It cannot manage drastic shifts in pH, oxygen or temperature. To place LUCA in the open ocean, even the ancient ocean, is to place a match in the wind. The remarkable truth is that LUCA was not primitive in the sense of being weak. It was exquisitely adapted, but adapted to a planet that bore little resemblance to the one we inhabit. The world of LUCA was defined by hydrogen seepage, carbon dioxide abundance, and a constant flow of electrons across iron-sulfur surfaces. These features created an environment that allowed early metabolic pathways to flourish. But as Earth changed, as photosynthesis later introduced oxygen, as continents stabilized, as oceans grew richer in diverse chemical environments, LUCA's strategies became liabilities rather than strengths. Its descendants survived by innovating. Some learned to harvest light. Others developed enzymes that defended against oxygen. Others became more robust, more independent of vent structures, more capable of shaping their own internal chemistry. Over billions of years, natural selection did not refine LUCA's strategies, it replaced them. That replacement can be traced in the genes that archaea and bacteria no longer share. LUCA represents the last moment before life diverged into two very different approaches to survival. What LUCA could not survive became exactly what its descendants mastered. To imagine LUCA dying instantly on modern Earth is not to diminish its significance, but to understand its context. Every organism is a mirror of the world that shaped it. LUCA's world was dark, mineral-rich, oxygen-free, and defined by gradients rather than sunlight. To survive today demands a different chemistry, a different membrane, a different relationship with the sky. The fact that LUCA would perish here underscores the vastness of time between then and now. It reminds us that life is not a single achievement, but a continuous negotiation between organisms and an ever-changing planet. In that sense, LUCA was not weak. It was a masterpiece of its moment, the first creature whose internal processes were coherent enough to persist across generations. It was the organism that established the rules, the genetic code, the ribosome, the use of proton gradients to power life. Everything since LUCA has been a variation on its theme. It could not survive our world, but our world could not exist without the world that shaped it, and yet its descendants would reshape that world entirely. Imagine a moment so ancient that time itself seems unfinished, when life had only just learned to persist, and the world held only one lineage capable of leaving descendants. Picture LUCA not as a singular triumph, but as a quiet threshold, a point after which life began to diverge into paths so different that for most of human history we did not realize they shared the same origin. What if I told you that every creature, every tree, every microbe, every breath of life on this planet traces back to a fork in an invisible road taken more than 3.5 billion years ago, in a world that bore no resemblance to ours? The revelation is both simple and profound. From LUCA emerged two great branches of life, bacteria and archaea. For decades, scientists assumed there were three domains, with eukaryotes, the lineage that would one day produce animals, plants, and fungi, forming a third pillar beside the other two. But the deeper genomic evidence accumulated over the past 20 years suggests something more surprising. Eukaryotes seem to have arisen not from a separate line, but from within the archaeal branch. The modern tree of life is not a tripod, but a forked staff with bacteria on one side and archaea, plus every complex organism on the other. This reorganization is not a small correction. It reframes our understanding of the earliest landscapes of life and reveals just how profoundly that first split shaped everything to come. We do not know the exact moment when bacteria and archaea diverged, nor do we know what pressures nudged a single ancestral population into two very different modes of living. Yet the genomic footprints left behind allow us to see the outlines of this separation. Bacteria and archaea share LUCA's essential tools: genetic code, ribosomes, metabolism built around proton gradients, and a basic template for cellular organization. But beyond these ancient features, their chemistry begins to diverge in ways subtle but absolute. Their membrane lipids are stitched from different chirality, meaning the basic direction of their molecular assembly is mirrored between the two groups. Their transcription machinery, the enzymes that read DNA, follow different architectures. Their cell walls form from different building blocks. The differences are so deep that even when these organisms occupy the same habitat today, their molecular lives run along separate tracks. The information encoded within their genomes suggests that environmental pressures were the sculptors of this divergence. Early Earth offered countless gradients: thermal, chemical, electrical, and life had to choose which of these to exploit. Bacteria appear to have embraced versatility, evolving metabolic strategies that allowed them to inhabit an extraordinary range of environments. They mastered photosynthesis, sulfur reduction, nitrogen fixation, and countless chemical pathways that let them colonize nearly every niche on the planet. Archaea, by contrast, often occupied the margins: boiling springs, salt flats, deep-sea vents, and environments saturated with methane or ammonia. They developed biochemical tools that allowed them to endure extremes that would unravel bacterial membranes and destroy their enzymes. Their differences are not evidence of distance, but of early specialization. As bacteria explored broad ecological possibilities, archaea became specialists in the world's harshest landscapes. Over millions of years, this divergence accelerated, guided by resource availability, environmental instability, and competition. Bacterial lineages expanded into the shallow oceans, shaping early biogeochemical cycles. Archaeal groups thrived in places where intense heat or acidity would have prevented bacterial growth. These patterns suggest that diversification was not a single event, but a prolonged unfolding, a gradual tightening of identity until two lineages stood so far apart that they could no longer exchange genes freely. Somewhere within this second branch, one archaeal lineage developed features that would one day allow a profound partnership: the endosymbiosis that gave rise to eukaryotes. Though this event belonged to a later chapter, its roots lie in the archaeal side of LUCA's fork. It was archaeal machinery that formed the earlier scaffolding for complex cells, setting the stage for the evolution of organelles, large genomes, cytoskeletons, and the intricate choreography of modern cellular life. Eukaryotes inherited their informational machinery from archaea, and their energetic machinery from bacteria, making complex life a bridge between the two ancient branches. The emergence of eukaryotes was not simply another diversification. It was a union of lineages separated since the dawn of biology. The rise of archaea in extreme environments and the explosive metabolic creativity of bacteria together shaped the planet long before multicellular life existed. Bacterial metabolisms transformed the atmosphere, altered ocean chemistry, and laid down minerals that persist in rock layers today. Archaeal methanogens contributed to early climate regulation. Both groups participated in the long, slow transformation of Earth's surface into a place where oxygen could accumulate, continents could stabilize, and the first complex ecosystems could form. The split from LUCA was not merely a branching but an engine for planetary change. The realization that LUCA's legacy is divergence rather than uniformity reframes our understanding of life's earlier story. LUCA did not produce descendants that resembled it. LUCA produced lineages that have abandoned its ways as soon as they gained the capacity. Life flourished not by perfecting a single strategy, but by multiplying possibilities. By becoming many, it increased its chances of survival, adaptation, and persistence across the unimaginable stretches of deep time. The world we know today, with its forests, oceans, animals, microbes, and humans, is the consequence of this divergence. Every leaf, every cell, every breath traces back not to LUCA alone, but to the moment life first turned away from itself. To see LUCA's imprint today, we must look not at fossils, but at every cell. Imagine holding an ancestor so old that the earth itself was still cooling, yet finding no bone, no imprint, no fossil to prove it ever lived. Picture a lineage whose presence cannot be traced in stone or sediment, because it lived in a world too soft and too unstable to preserve anything but chemical echoes. What if I told you that the earliest ancestor of every creature alive today has left no physical remains at all, and that the only place its memory survives is inside us, not in our skeletons, but in our cells, in the machinery that keeps us alive each moment we breathe? This is the revelation at the core of LUCA's story. We cannot study it through archaeology in the traditional sense. We cannot visit a site and brush dust off ancient structures. We cannot extract its remains from shale. LUCA left nothing behind that can be uncovered with tools. Instead, what survives is molecular, a quiet inheritance maintained through billions of years of descent. Every living organism on Earth still carries fragments of LUCA's genome, not as relics, but as active instructions, still read, still translated, still essential. LUCA's presence is inside every ribosome that assembles a protein, inside every strand of DNA that encodes a gene, inside every molecule of ATP our bodies use for energy. Its evidence is not physical, it is functional. To begin understanding LUCA's molecular imprint, we must look at the structures that have changed least over time. Among them, ribosomes stand out as some of the most ancient molecular machines on Earth. All organisms rely on ribosomes to translate genetic code into proteins. When scientists compare ribosomal RNA and ribosomal proteins across bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, they find patterns so consistent that they must have originated in a common ancestor. The architecture of the ribosome's core, the part that performs the essential task of linking amino acids together, is nearly identical across all life. We do not know for certain what LUCA's ribosomes looked like, but the evidence suggests they were already complex, already capable of accurate translation, and already functioning with a precision that modern organisms have preserved. Even more striking is the universality of the genetic code. Across almost all life, the same codon patterns direct the same amino acids. There are minor deviations in some organisms and mitochondria, but the overwhelming pattern is uniform. This near-universal code is one of the strongest clues that all living things share a common ancestry. If life had emerged multiple times independently, we might expect different coding systems, different rules for translation, different interpretations of the same triplets of nucleotides. Instead, every living cell follows the same chemical language, as though inheriting a script written once and then preserved through uncounted generations. This shared code acts like an ancient manuscript copied faithfully across eons. The molecular imprint of LUCA extends into energy metabolism as well. All organisms use a molecule called ATP as their energetic currency. The machinery that produces ATP varies in detail between bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Yet the core components, ATP synthase, the proton-driven motor that creates ATP, are universal. The enzyme's rotating mechanism is present across all domains of life and appears to predate LUCA itself, suggesting that LUCA inherited an even earlier version. The fact that this machinery is conserved across such immense timescales indicates that any attempt to change it drastically would have disrupted essential metabolic processes. LUCA's world may have been alien, but its way of storing energy survives in every living organism today. Core metabolic enzymes tell a similar story. Many ancient pathways, such as those involved in synthesizing amino acids, nucleotides, and fundamental cofactors, exist with variations across all domains of life. These pathways are not modern inventions. They are ancient solutions to ancient problems. Their presence, with deep structural similarities across lineages, suggests that LUCA already possessed a functioning central metabolism. This does not mean LUCA was complex in a modern sense. It means that once certain biochemical strategies emerged, they became indispensable, carried forward through countless evolutionary branches all the way to the present. Studying LUCA through these molecular traces is not straightforward. Phylogenetic reconstruction relies on comparing modern genomes, but ancient DNA itself does not survive beyond a few million years, and LUCA lived more than 3.5 billion years ago. We therefore extrapolate backward from what exists now. This method has limits. We must distinguish between genes inherited from LUCA and genes acquired later through horizontal transfer. We must account for gene loss, mutation, convergence, and divergence. And yet, despite these complications, certain patterns rise above the noise. Genes involved in translation, energy conversion, and central metabolism appear consistently across all major branches of life, indicating that they likely belong to LUCA's core genetic repertoire. One of the challenges in reconstructing LUCA is that evolution is not a tidy process. It does not leave clean chronological sequences or consistent mutation rates. Instead, it preserves what works and discards what does not. LUCA's genome was not a blueprint in the modern sense, but a collection of functional necessities. Over billions of years, many genes have been heavily modified, duplicated, fused, or replaced. Yet the deepest, most fundamental ones remain recognizable. They act like geological strata within our biochemistry, each layer recording an earlier phase of life's development. The absence of fossils can feel disorienting, but it is not surprising. LUCA lived in a world without hard parts, without shells or skeletons. Its environment was fluid and volatile, its body soft, microscopic and ephemeral. Nothing it produced would have remained intact long enough to fossilize. Its legacy endures not in sediments but in sequences, ribosomal RNA loops, conserved amino acid motifs, catalytic cores of enzymes, the universality of ATP synthesis. LUCA's remains are not objects to be held. They are processes that continue to operate inside every living being. To study LUCA is therefore to study ourselves. Every cell in our bodies contains ribosomes that are direct descendants of LUCA's ribosomes. Every codon in our DNA uses the same nearly universal language LUCA used. Every molecule of ATP that fuels our thoughts uses a mechanism LUCA helped pioneer. LUCA's evidence is not hidden in the earth. It is hidden in the continuity of life. It is present in the unfathomable stability of molecular systems that have survived longer than any mountain range. The realization is as quiet as it is profound. LUCA did not leave bones, tools, imprints, or markings. It left something far more enduring. Instructions. Instructions that are still read, still copied, still enacted billions of years later. LUCA's legacy is written not in stone but in the living machinery of every organism on the planet. To find our earliest ancestor, we do not look outward into the Earth's strata. We look inward into the cells that carry LUCA's memory in their structure, their code, and their chemistry. These instructions reveal not just a past but a pattern. Imagine standing before a world so young that its crust has barely cooled, its oceans newly settled, its storms still carrying the heat of planetary birth. Now imagine realizing that on this world, life appears not as a rare accident, but as something that blooms almost as soon as the environment allows. The hook is subtle, but unnerving in its implications. If life began so quickly on Earth, was it ever truly unlikely? Or is the emergence of biology the natural consequence of a planet learning to breathe? We do not know for certain, but the evidence suggests that life takes far less time to appear than the universe took to forge the atoms that compose it. The revelation is stark. Geological traces from roughly 4,300,000,000 years ago, found in the isotopic signatures of ancient zircon crystals and graphite inclusions, indicate that carbon had already been processed through metabolic-like pathways. In other words, as soon as Earth stabilized enough to hold oceans and maintain repeating cycles of heat and chemistry, something began altering matter from the inside. It was not yet complex life. It may not even have been cellular, but it was directional, it was organized, and it left a chemical fingerprint that does not match simple geological processes. Through these early signatures, we glimpse a world where life is not so much improbable as it is impatient. The information we have is scattered and fragile, but remarkably consistent. The first piece rests in the stability of organic chemistry under environmental rhythms driven by hydrothermal vents. These structures, rich with mineral catalysts, acted as natural reactors, sustaining chemical gradients over timescales long enough for complexity to accumulate. The second piece comes from laboratory experiments in which protocells repeatedly emerge from fatty acids, lipids, and heat cycles, requiring no design beyond the physics of amphiphilic molecules. They assemble, they break apart, they reassemble, not because they are alive, but because the conditions themselves encourage enclosure, concentration, and repetition. A third piece lies in entropy-driven self-organization. Open systems that receive continuous energy do not drift toward disorder. They often create islands of structure that dissipate energy more efficiently. Researchers such as Jeremy England have framed this process mathematically, showing that collections of molecules exposed to consistent driving forces naturally evolve toward configurations that absorb and disperse energy more effectively. This creates a thermodynamic incentive for complexity long before the first genes appear. Finally, computational models reveal that when energy flow, catalytic surfaces, and molecular diversity reach sufficient density, the emergence of self-sustaining reaction networks is not only possible, but statistically favoured. Taken together, these lines of evidence lead toward a realization that is both comforting and unsettling. Earth did not wait for life. Life emerged the moment Earth allowed it. The distinction between chemistry and biology begins to feel less like a boundary and more like a slope, as if the planet, once cooled enough to hold oceans and stable enough to repeat its cycles, created the right conditions and then stepped back as complexity rose like mist from warm waters. Here, the hypnotic part of the story unfolds quietly. Life becomes less a miraculous exception, and more the expected outcome of a world with enough energy, enough diversity, and enough time. It is a shift in perspective that changes what it means to be alive. If life is inevitable under certain conditions, then the rarity lies not in biology, but in planets that can hold a long breath without interruption. There is another way to sense how quickly the world leaned toward biology, and it comes from the geological quiet between cataclysms. Even when the planet was struck by continent-sized impacts, or when the mantle overturned in violent resurfacing, the traces of early chemistry appear to have resumed almost immediately, as if the planet was unwilling to return to simplicity. We do not know for certain how many times Earth was sterilized in those first few 100 million years, but the evidence suggests that each recovery was faster than the one before it. Minerals that form only in the presence of biological fractionation reappear in younger rocks with almost no delay, hinting that the underlying reactions rebuilt themselves with a kind of stubborn continuity. If life were truly fragile, we might expect gaps, pauses, or long silences in the chemical record. Instead, the gaps are narrow, the silences are brief. The pattern keeps re-emerging with an almost rhythmic insistence. Some researchers have pointed to the uncanny stability of certain molecular ratios preserved in ancient sediments, ratios that do not arise from random reactions but from systems that maintain themselves once started. These patterns behave like echoes of processes that, once set in motion, continued as long as the environment fed them energy. There is a quiet elegance in this idea, that the earliest steps toward life were not singular events but ongoing negotiations between matter and the world that surrounded it. Every tide, every thermal pulse, every shift in the crust provided another chance for organization to reappear, as though Earth itself kept offering the same exam until complexity passed it. Other clues lie in the way modern organisms handle their most ancient molecules. Many of the enzymes responsible for the earliest metabolic pathways appear unnecessarily conservative, preserving chemical steps that could easily be simplified or replaced. Yet they remain, almost ceremonial in their function, as though life still carries an ancestral script it cannot fully set aside. These relics of early metabolism suggest that once a chemical pattern became established, it was easier to inherit it than to reinvent it. This conservatism hints that the emergence of life was not a dramatic leap from disorder, but a series of small commitments, each reinforcing the next until a threshold was crossed and could not be uncrossed. When researchers model these commitments mathematically, they often find that order arises within surprisingly narrow conditions, but the more refined the models become, the broader those conditions appear. Temperature gradients, mineral scaffolds, proton flows, wet-dry cycles, ultraviolet-driven synthesis. Each can produce organized chemistry, and in many simulations they do so repeatedly. It is as though the planet had been fitted with multiple redundant engines for building complexity. If one environment failed, another continued. If one reaction broke apart, another took its place. The inevitability suggested by these models does not diminish the wonder of life's emergence. Instead, it reframes it. The miracle is not that life appeared once, but that the Earth was structured in so many ways that something like life would have appeared no matter where one began the calculation. And perhaps the most humbling insight comes from the fact that none of these early processes seem to have had a preferred direction until the moment replication gained even the slightest foothold. Once that happened, evolution became a river that could only flow forward. But in the time before replication, chemistry wandered, explored, built, dissolved, and reassembled with no destination in mind. That wandering appears to have filled the planet with a kind of restless readiness, a molecular landscape so saturated with potential that when the first replicators emerged, the world was already prepared to welcome them. Earth, in those moments, was not waiting passively. It was participating, testing combinations, allowing structures to rise and collapse, shaping the possibilities through energy and environment. In that sense, life was not an interruption of the planet's rhythms, but one of its most natural forms of expression. When the first replicating systems appeared, they were stepping into a world that had already begun writing the prologue. And if such a prologue can be written once, under the right conditions, there is little reason to believe it cannot be written again. Imagine a world where the first stirrings of chemistry have not yet chosen a direction, where oceans sit beneath unfamiliar skies, and nothing on the surface knows what it means to breathe, to grow, or to remember. When we look for life beyond Earth, We're not searching for creatures or plants or distant mirrors of ourselves. We are searching for the conditions that once made chemistry lean forward, just slightly, until it began to hold its shape. And so the question arises with quiet insistence. If LUCA arose here, on this small restless world, what stops life from rising somewhere else? What binds life to Earth, and what frees it from our particular darkness and light? The wonder lies in the fact that the universe is vast, and in many corners of that vastness, the early Earth does not seem unique at all. Scientists do not know how common Earth-like conditions truly are, but the evidence we have gathered in the last few decades has transformed our sense of cosmic isolation. Where earlier generations saw cold, indifferent skies, we now see places shaped by heat, pressure, water, and energy. The very same ingredients that once drove Earth toward biology. The revelation, emerging slowly from telescopes and spacecraft and mathematical observation, is that the universe contains countless environments that resemble the world before life. Some are hidden beneath ice. Some orbit distant suns. Some drift through the darkness, carrying oceans sealed beneath frozen crusts. And in each, the same quiet forces that shaped LUCA might be at work. Gradients, disequilibria, cycles, and the subtle encouragement of energy flowing through matter. Consider Saturn's small moon, Enceladus. At first glance, it looks barren, a sphere of white ice drifting through the gravitation of a giant. But when NASA's Cassini spacecraft passed close to it, something astonishing happened. From fractures near its south pole, fountains of vapour erupted into space, scattering ice and dust that the spacecraft flew directly through. What Cassini detected in those plumes startled even the most cautious researchers. Hydrogen gas in concentrations far beyond expectation. Salts and simple organic molecules, fragments of compounds that could only have been shaped in a liquid ocean beneath the crust. Hydrogen gas is not merely a curiosity. It is the same kind of chemical fuel that early Earth vent systems likely used. The same gradient-rich environment that once supported LUCA's ancestors. In Enceladus, it appears that water meets rock under immense pressure, generating chemical energy again and again, as though the moon contains its own version of our planet's first laboratories. Europa offers a different but equally compelling glimpse into the possible. Beneath its thick, icy shell, Jupiter's tides knead the moon like dough, flexing it with enormous gravitational force. That flexing produces heat, and that heat sustains a global ocean larger than all of Earth's oceans combined. The world beneath Europa's ice is timelessly dark, but it is not still. Models suggest currents, circulation, chemical mixing, and perhaps even seafloor vents similar to those that drove early metabolism on Earth. Though we do not know what reactions take place there, the mere fact of a deep ocean warmed by the moon's interior creates a setting where chemistry can be coaxed beyond simplicity. Jupiter's radiation would make Europa's surface hostile, but that same radiation fractures water molecules in the ice, creating oxidants that could sink into the ocean below. If those oxidants meet hydrothermally formed reductants at depth, a disequilibrium forms, a tension that nature often resolves by building complexity. Scientists have begun to suspect that many more moons in the outer solar system hide similar oceans. Ganymede, with its layered seas and conductive salt water. Titan, whose methane lakes on the surface distract from the possibility of liquid reservoirs hidden deeper within. Even Pluto, once thought to be a frozen relic, may harbour a buried ocean warmed by radioactive decay and insulated by nitrogen ice. Each of these worlds tells a similar story. Water and energy are not rare. They are abundant. And whenever water and energy coexist for long enough, chemistry begins to repeat itself, to explore the same possibilities, to test the same combinations. Beyond the solar system, the search expands into distances almost too vast for intuition. Yet exoplanet surveys have revealed thousands of worlds orbiting other stars, many rocky, many warm, many situated at just the distance where liquid water could exist. Some of these planets show evidence of volcanic activity, either through atmospheric signatures or through modelled thermal profiles. Volcanism matters because it supplies the same chemical gradients that once shaped LUCA's environment: hydrogen from water rock interactions, carbon dioxide from mantle gases, and mineral-rich surfaces capable of stabilizing fragile molecules. Others orbit red dwarf stars that bathe their worlds in constant low-level radiation, a source of energy that could drive early organic synthesis in ways not possible on Earth. Even those planets unearthed indirectly show signs that excite researchers. A world might dim its star's light in a pattern that suggests cloud cover, a potential clue for water cycling. Another might exhibit slight shifts that imply a heavy atmosphere, the kind capable of trapping heat or maintaining surface pressure needed for stable oceans. A few worlds show atmospheric hints of methane and carbon dioxide together, a combination that on Earth is rarely stable without biological influence, but in a prebiotic context may signal constant replenishment from geological processes. The possibilities widen with each discovery. Life might require only a subset of ingredients that the universe appears ready to provide. Still, it is necessary to speak with humility. We do not know whether the chemical pathways that led to LUCA are common or uniquely earthly. Hydrothermal vents on another world may replicate the same gradients, yet never cross the threshold into replication. Oceans may remain eternally prebiotic, rich with chemistry but absent direction. Some exoplanets may lose their water too quickly. Others may be buried in ice too thick for energy to penetrate. The universe offers opportunities but makes no promises, and our tools for detection remain primitive compared to the distances involved. We can infer chemistry from spectra, but we cannot yet taste an alien ocean or measure a vent's gradient from light years away. The silence we hear is not evidence of absence. It is the limit of our instruments. Even so, the pattern resonates. Wherever we look, we find the same building blocks, the same interactions, the same pathways that on Earth eventually led to memory, metabolism, and inheritance. Amino acids form in interstellar space. Sugars appear on irradiated ices. Organic molecules coat meteorites that fall on deserts and frozen lakes. Water is common. Heat is common. Energy flow is common. The universe seems predisposed to complexity, not hostile to it. And if that is true, then LUCA may be unique only in its circumstance, not in its possibility. The story told on Earth might be one version among many, shaped by local geology and specific gradients, but not fundamentally different from paths that could arise elsewhere. Perhaps the deepest realization is that life's emergence may not require miracles, only persistence. A planet that maintains its oceans for long enough, a source of energy that does not waver, a niche where chemistry can repeat itself across millions of years without interruption. These conditions are not rare. They are scattered across our galaxy like seeds whose destinies remain unseen. If life began here because Earth allowed it, then life might begin elsewhere for the same reason. The universe is not empty. It is unfinished. And so we search, not with expectation, but with patience. We send probes to icy moons. We listen for atmospheric signatures across light years. We study the rocks beneath our feet to understand the world that shaped LUCA, because in doing so we sharpen the lens through which we view other worlds. The search is not only outward, It is inward. The chemistry that first learned to persist is the same chemistry that lets us ask these questions. The search continues, not to find LUCA again, but to understand why life appeared at all and why matter, when given the chance, chose to continue. And so the search continues, not to find LUCA again, but to understand why life appeared at all.